Before the light, there is the smell. Cold ash, damp earth, and underneath it, the faint tang of iron and old smoke soaked into timber and clay. Then the sound, the scrape of a shovel through embers, the creak of a bellows arm, and finally, low and steady, the breath of a fire waking up. This is what reaches you first, long before you see the low workshop with its wattle walls and its smoke-blackened roof hole. A day like this begins before anyone else in the settlement has opened their eyes. A smith like this rises in darkness, because the fire cannot be rushed. The hearth is not lit fresh each morning. A bed of charcoal has been banked overnight, kept just alive under ash, and the first task is to coax it back from a dull red core into something that will hold real heat. You crouch at the tuyere, the clay-lined pipe that feeds air into the hearth, and work the bellows in slow, even strokes. Too fast, and you waste breath and fuel. Too slow, and the coals cool. Charcoal is fetched from a covered store, never green wood, because only charcoal burns hot and clean enough for ironwork, without the tars and moisture that would ruin the temperature and foul the metal. Alongside the fuel, the day's raw stock is checked. Iron blooms or bar stock, traded in from a bloomery, sorted by feel and by the marks left on them from earlier working. Tools are laid within reach in a fixed order, because in the coming hours there will be no time to search. Tongs of several jaw widths, a set of hammers from heavy sledge to light finishing hammer, a hardie fixed in the anvil's hardie hole for cutting stock, punches, and a trough of water standing ready by the anvil's foot. None of this is decoration. Every item earns its place through use. The first task of the day is rarely glamorous. A household brings a broken sickle, its edge chipped and its tang loosened from the wooden handle. This is the bread and butter work that any village smith like this would recognize instantly. Not a sword, not armor, but the tools that keep a farm running. The blade goes into the fire, buried in the coals rather than laid on top, so the heat reaches it evenly rather than scorching one face. You watch the metal, waiting for it to pass through the dull red of underheating into a brighter orange, the point at which iron becomes soft enough to move under the hammer without cracking. Drawn from the fire, it is laid on the anvil face and struck in controlled, angled blows that stretch and realign the metal at the damaged edge, closing the gap left by the chip. The tang is reheated separately, and a new socket is drawn out and shaped to grip the handle firmly again. It is unremarkable work, and that is exactly the point. This is the labor that quietly keeps a harvest possible. Understanding the craft itself means understanding what heat actually does to iron. Raw iron at working temperature is not liquid, as some assume. It becomes plastic, soft enough to be pushed and drawn under repeated hammer blows without melting, its internal structure of iron crystals sliding and reforming under force and heat together. Each blow does two things at once. It shapes the metal, and it works out gas pockets and slag inclusions left over from smelting, compacting the material and making it stronger. A smith like this does not simply hit metal. He reads how it moves under the hammer, adjusting the angle and force blow by blow, because iron that resists correctly is iron that is at the right temperature, and iron that moves too easily is iron on the edge of burning. And here is the part that still stops people when they understand it properly. There was no thermometer, no dial, nothing but the eye. A smith like this judges the exact working temperature of iron by its color alone. And this was not guesswork, it was a genuinely reliable system, because iron's color changes in a fixed, physical sequence as it heats, tied directly to the glow given off by the metal itself at each temperature band. A dull cherry red sits at one working range, suitable for the coarser movement of shaping thick stock. A brighter orange-yellow marks the ideal range for most forging and welding work, where the metal is soft enough to move cleanly, but not yet approaching the danger zone. White, sparking heat is a warning, not an achievement. It means the iron is beginning to burn, oxidizing and losing carbon and strength with every second it stays there, and pulling it clear at exactly that instant. No earlier and no later separates competent work from ruined stock. This judgment had to be made in consistent, shadowed light, which is one real reason forges were kept dim rather than in bright daylight. Not for atmosphere, but because a smith needed to see colour accurately, and bright outdoor light would wash out the subtle gradations that told him everything he needed to know. Sound played its part too. The hiss and spark pattern off the anvil under the hammer told an experienced ear when a weld was about to take or fail. And smell carried its own warning, since scorched iron gives off a distinctive sharp odour just before it burns. None of this was mystical. It was decades of repeated, attentive observation compressed into instant recognition. And it worked because the physics of heated metal is genuinely consistent enough to be read this way, every single time. Later in the day comes the harder task, the kind of order that raises both the stakes and the standing of the man doing the work. Perhaps it is a seax blade commissioned for a household head, or an iron plough coulter needed before the ground turns. This work demands pattern control across a longer piece, sustained heats, and in the case of a blade, careful attention to the edge steel, where a harder, higher carbon strip may be forge-welded onto a softer iron body, giving a blade that holds an edge without becoming so brittle it snaps under impact. Forge welding demands the iron surfaces be brought to a near-white, sparking heat at the very edge of burning, fluxed with sand or ash to keep oxides from blocking the join, then struck together fast and true before the heat drops away. A weld that fails here is not simply wasted labour. It can mean a blade that fractures in use, or a tool that lets down the household depending on it. There is no room here for a lucky guess. The trade takes a real physical toll, and it is worth being plain about it rather than romantic. The heat of the hearth over hours produces genuine burns, small and large, across the forearms and hands over a working life. Skeletal evidence from early medieval smithing sites shows patterns consistent with repetitive strain in the shoulders and lower back from years of hammerwork, along with occasional healed fractures from workshop accidents. Smoke inhalation from charcoal and from the fluxes used in welding was a real, sustained exposure, breathed in daily rather than in one dramatic incident. This was not a trade defined by constant mortal danger, but it was one that left its mark on the body over a lifetime of repeated, controlled labour, in the same way that any sustained physical craft does to those who practice it for decades. What a community loses without a smith like this is concrete and immediate, not abstract. Ploughshares and coulters dull and cannot be resharpened. Sickles and scythes fail at harvest when timing determines whether grain is brought in before weather turns against it. Nails, hinges and fittings for building work stop, slowing repairs to halls and storehouses. Weapons and fittings for a lord's retinue go unmade or unmended, weakening a household's ability to defend itself or fulfill its obligations. A settlement without access to ironworking does not merely lose convenience, It loses the tools that make farming, building and defence possible at all, which is precisely why smiths appear consistently in the documentary and archaeological record as figures tied closely to estates and settlements, sometimes with land or status attached to the role itself. That dependence is exactly why real skill in this trade carried real standing. A smith whose blades held their edge, whose welds did not fail, whose ploughshares lasted seasons rather than weeks, built a reputation that travelled by word between households and estates. This was not glamour in the way a warrior's reputation was glamour. It was trust. The kind that meant a lord or a free farming household would return to the same hands year after year, and would value those hands enough to see the position as a specialized, valued craft, rather than common labor. Any village that had a smith like this depended on him in ways that were rarely spoken aloud, but were understood by everyone who brought him work. By evening, the fire is banked down again, the roar reduced to a low, steady breath, then to a soft crackle, then to almost nothing but a dull orange glow beneath grey ash. The smell of hot iron and charcoal smoke lingers in the thatch and in the smith's own clothing long after the last blow has been struck. Tools are wiped and set back in their fixed places for tomorrow. What remains, cooling on the bench in the half-dark, is not glory or spectacle, but a mended sickle, a strengthened blade, a fitting that will hold. Small, unremarkable, essential objects that will carry a household through the season ahead, made possible by one set of trained hands and a fire that never quite goes out.